Welcome, Big Ten fans. This is Big Ten Ted Live. Happy Friday night, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome into Big Ten Ted Live. On this channel, we are all things Big Ten. But you know what's happening tonight? We're shifting to the Pacific Northwest. It is all things Oregon, one of those newest additions, Oregon and Washington, 17 and 18 to our beloved Big Ten Conference. Here in just a little bit, I am going to welcome in Doug Scott from the QB11 show, one of the very best Oregon podcasts out there. We're going to be talking everything Oregon coming into the Big Ten. How are they going to compete in the Big Ten? Where are they going to stack up? It's going to be a great conversation with Doug. Really looking forward to that. But before we get in to Doug here tonight, just a couple of things. For you Oregon fans, this is the place for all things Big Ten. If you want to get a little bit of a head start on knowing about your Big Ten brethren, hit that subscribe button so you can get updates when we go live, uploaded videos, previews, reactions, all sorts of stuff like that. Chats and super chats, a great way to get involved. If you've got a question for Doug, if you've got a question for me, or if you've just got a comment overall, a chat or a super chat is a great way to do that. Here's what we got coming up on the show as well in the live department. First, coming up on Tuesday night, I'm going to be chatting with Bomber Brown from Big 12 Mafia, kind of a Big 10, Big 12 crossover. Going to be talking some Big 10, Big 12 non-conference games. You know, the Big 10 and the Big 12 are two conferences that are looking pretty darn strong right now. So we're going to be talking about their role in the future of college football, in the future of college athletics. That's on Tuesday. Stay tuned for August 23rd as well. Wednesday, August 23rd. That's my Big 10 Predictions live show. Going to be predicting every single game that Big 10 football teams will be playing this fall. Also, I'm looking at putting together a star-studded cast of guests that night as well. Coming up on Monday, also I'm going to have a conversation with Zach Sako from Locked On Nittany Lions. Drew Aller, is he going to live up to the hype? That will drop Monday morning at 8 a.m. Yes, there's a lot coming up. The season is right around the corner, and this is your place for Big Ten coverage all season long. All right, we know what tonight's about. It's time to quack. It's time to quack with our guy right now, Doug Scott, joining us. Doug, there he is. Thanks for being with us tonight on Big Ten Ted Live. I am so excited to have you on board, going through. It's Oregon. It was last Friday, 7 days from now. We were talking about Oregon. We were talking about, Washington. Yeah, who cares about them, though, right? We're talking about the Ducks, though, entering the Big Ten Conference. I was up in Canada trying to be on vacation, trying to get a hike, and I tweeted it before because there were kind of rumblings a week before this would happen. Oregon, Washington, they could move to the Big Ten. I tweeted it, say, hey, just wait till I'm back on vacation, man, and then we'll cover it then. They couldn't wait. On Friday, last Friday, ended up Oregon, Washington. The announcement was made that they're joining the Big Ten. What was your first thoughts when you heard Oregon was finally got that invitation to come into the Big Ten?
Boy, it's a lot. First of all, Ted, thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate being here. I'm excited to talk to you tonight about the Oregon Ducks and hopefully give your listeners and viewers a chance to learn a little bit more about maybe who we are and where we're going as a program. Relief was definitely up there. Excitement for sure. I think as we all know, with the changing landscape of college sports and particularly college football and everything, after the Texas and Oklahoma move, and then certainly after the LA schools moved to the Big Ten a year ago, it certainly feels like we're all steamrolling toward, the Power 2 era, right? The Power 5 era is over. We're moving into a Power 2 era. That's my opinion. I think I feel pretty strongly about that. And if you're not in that club, you want to be in that club and you need to be in that club. And so there was a lot of excitement, relief, and that's been my approach about it. There's certainly a lot of Duck fans who feel some sadness and remorse about what they're losing in a 100-year-old conference. And that's all valid as well. I'm more of a looking forward person, and I'm excited about the future of the Oregon Ducks program in the Big Ten Conference.
Oh, the future is bright. I'll tell you that much. And we're going to get into what Oregon has looked like in the last couple of years. You know, from afar, the Big Ten, well, it used to be the Big Ten was pretty far away geographically from the Pac-12. Now they're just all one big thing, and geography doesn't really mean much anymore. So we're going to talk about what Oregon is looking like in the future. And we're going to talk about a lot of stuff on the football field, athletically, but and we're going to kind of go back and forth in this discussion a little bit. But there's one thing I want to ask. You know, with Oregon joining the Big Ten, there's going to be a lot of fans supporting other teams and in other parts of the Big Ten footprint. They're going to be making their way to the state of Oregon probably for the very first time. You know, when I think of Oregon outside of the Ducks, I think of the last remaining blockbuster is in Bend, Oregon, right? It's still there, right? It's still there. Okay. And then I think about, I'm an outdoors guy. I think of Crater Lake. What should people know about the state of Oregon if they're making their way over to Autzen Stadium here in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very diverse and beautiful state from that standpoint, right? You've got the Pacific Ocean, you got 300 miles of coastline. You got everything from sandy beaches to rocky cliffs to forest, forest outcroppings over the ocean, right? So just that whole part of the state, you kind of walk through the various biomes of the state, and the state's very green, especially the western part of the state, the coast. You don't want to swim much in the ocean. It's pretty cold. You get your wetsuit out. There's some decent surfing somewhere. If you're a golfer, one of the absolutely highest rated golf courses in the entire world is a tiny little town in Southern Oregon called Bandon. It's Bandon Dunes Golf Club. They have 5 now, like championship caliber golf courses. People travel from all over the world to go there. It's absolutely phenomenal as a golfer. It's a tiny little hole in the wall town, Southern Oregon coast. And then you move into the valley, right? So you got most of the people in Oregon live in the Willamette Valley. So Portland, Salem, Eugene, Medford, the whole corridor there, about an hour away from the coast, about an hour away from the mountains, the Cascade Mountains. Kind of what's next. You got Mount Hood, you got snow caps, you got skiing, you got all the winter recreational activities, mountain lakes like Crater Lake, as well as all the Cascade Lakes up in there. And then as you get into Eastern Oregon, you get to Bend, and then over to Central Oregon and over to Eastern Oregon, you get a desert and highlands and kind of some of that stuff. So it's very diverse, but very beautiful. It's a big state size wise, population wise, not as much. So it's mostly all concentrated in that Portland to Medford corridor, and then the rest of the state's pretty sparsely populated in a lot of places.
All right, we came to talk football. We came to talk.
We did.
So we'll just get that out of the way. Let's move on here in just a little bit. One thing that really stood out to me that intrigued me from the Big Ten perspective, and maybe from an outsider's perspective, we think about Oregon when we talk about rivalries, because that's kind of a big thing in conference realignment. We're losing rivalries, right? When I think of Oregon, and we talked about this offline, I talked about Civil War, Oregon State, but you were talking this Washington rivalry, which has now been played 114, 115 times, something like that. Yeah. Actually, even before they enter the Big Ten, that still might be Oregon's top rival right now.
Oh, not might be. I mean, there's no question about it. It is, and it has been for, 30 plus years. I mean, obviously going back to the ancient days, the Civil War rivalry, and it's still an important rivalry, right? I don't want to discount that, but it was certainly the rivalry for Oregon and Oregon State to kind of own the state, in the early years, and even up through the 80s when both teams were pretty bad, to be honest. But as Oregon kind of took off in the 90s, and as well as some other history with Washington, that Oregon versus Washington rivalry really became the number one rivalry for both Oregon and Washington. And I just want to make it clear, we're number 17 and they're number 18 as far as Big Ten membership. So there's no doubt about that one. But no, that's really the primary rivalry. It really has been for about 30 years. So, we're not losing that. And I think there's going to be a lot of Big Ten fans who come to realize that there's a lot of hate in that rivalry. It may not be as well known nationwide, but on a per capita basis, there's a pretty spicy rivalry. There's a lot of history there, a lot of bad blood.
And I'm looking forward to that because in preparation for this show tonight, I'm looking back on some Oregon games last season. That Washington game was a great contest a year ago where Bo Nix just threw it a little bit short there at the end. But kind of moving on right now, when people think of Oregon, maybe outside of Duck Nation right now, they think of Phil Knight. They think of flashy uniforms. They think of Chip Kelly, up-tempo, basketball on grass, I think it almost used to be called. But what is different maybe about that era, about Oregon football in the present? What should people know about
Yeah.
Oregon football that they maybe don't know?
Yeah, I mean, we still do flashy uniforms. I think they've been a little more toned down over the last 5 or 6 years than some of the ones we've done in the past. I think that is part of our DNA, part of our identity. We actually say innovation is our tradition at Oregon.
Sure.
So I mean, we're always going to do that because that's kind of part of our DNA. And I actually looking forward to bringing some uniform excitement. I think the Big Ten Conference is a little traditional on the uniform
Very
front.
traditional.
There's not there's some alternates you see here and there. Obviously, Maryland's trying to do their thing. Not going to go there too much, but yeah, I think I'm excited to bring some of that to the Big Ten. But really, I think on the field, that some of that Chip Kelly stuff has morphed, right? I think especially if you look over the Mario Cristobal era, you saw an emphasis on the line of scrimmage under his tenure, particularly on the offensive line of scrimmage, and really becoming a ground and pound football team. He actually played a pretty slow tempo as well, which was an adjustment for a lot of Oregon fans, and one that I don't think. I mean, you're not going to complain about winning games, but when you're winning at an okay rate, or when you're not maybe performing at the level you're used to, or the excitement level you're used to, there's a little bit of down there. I think where we're seeing under Lanning is a continued emphasis in the trenches, particularly now on the defensive line of scrimmage. We can get into recruiting and all that stuff later, and talent and roster makeup and all that. But I think you're seeing a continuity to that, but also embracing, under the Lanning era, a little bit more back to the roots of up tempo, playing fast, 11 personnel, getting out, using speed. Right, there's been a lot more emphasis on increasing the team speed and adding new players who are team speed. So I think we're trying to blend a little bit of both. Like, still want to play a little bit like we did in the Chip Kelly era with speed and excitement, but also with power at the same time.
Yeah, it looks. When I was watching, I just watched highlights. I'm not watching a full game play by play kind of breakdown of this. I did notice kind of what you said. It's a little bit of a hybrid. You do see some of that up tempo. You do see Bo Nix pushing the football down the field, but you do see some better, maybe improved line play than maybe you saw a little bit more physical up front than maybe you saw under the Chip Kelly era. And I think that's important. I kind of want to segue that into my next point. When we talk about the Big Ten, we talk about people talk about physicality. We talk about playing big boy football. We talk about that 9-game conference grind. How do you think Oregon is going to transfer over? Because I've talked to some USC people on my show before, and they've gloated over their record over Big Ten teams over the years in one game in their backyard at the Rose Bowl. And it is
20 years ago.
History. Exactly. Okay. All right. We're on the same page now. But so when I look at that, I say that's one game in your backyard in Pasadena. Yeah. Go through a 9-game conference grind. How do you think the Ducks, do you think they have the personnel right now to be able to transfer that and still win 9, 10, maybe 11 games in the Big Ten?
Sure. So I think if you look at what Oregon has done on the recruiting trail the last 6 years under Mario, and now even more so under Lanning, I think they're in the style of football, the physical style of play, particularly on the defensive line of scrimmage. If you look at the last couple of recruiting classes, I think what you're really doing is building up those trenches to be able to compete in the physical style play in the Big Ten on a game by game basis. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say we're going to walk into the Big Ten Conference and win, dominate year one, right? Finish second or whatever. Like, I'm a realist, right? The level of competition is higher on a week to week basis. I think Oregon has the talent and the physicality and everything that they need to compete at a high level in that conference in a very short period of time. But it doesn't mean that it just happens, right? They still got to come and do it, and they got to go through that grind at least, and experience that, and the travel, right? It's a lot more road games, going out east, further distances. I think that's somewhat overblown by a lot of people, but it's not a nothing.
I can't remember if it was your podcast or if it was somebody else's, but they were kind of comparing the travel, because that's been a big discussion throughout all of this. Well, we're going across the country. Rutgers flying to Eugene. You've got College Park, Maryland to Los Angeles, California. But there's a decent amount of flying and air travel right now in the pack. Like, if you look at even like LA up to Seattle, that's no short trip. That is a longer trip. So how much of a concern is, for football, it's not that big of a deal. You fly out there one day, you fly back. It's the Olympic sports. It's your basketballs, it's your volleyballs, your softballs, things like that. How much of an impact of travel do you think is going to happen when Oregon does join the Big Ten?
Yeah, I mean, on the football field, I think you said it right. Right. I mean, a lot of people on the East Coast, especially you go to like SEC country and along the Eastern Seaboard where the ACC is, and they can drive everywhere,
Yeah.
right? So I think people don't understand, like, these teams out west are already getting, every game is a flight, every single one. There's no other than Oregon State, right? And the same thing for fans. So I think there's an obviously going a 4-hour flight instead of a 3-hour flight or a 2.5-hour flight. It's a minor difference in football. I think it is those other sports you're talking about where it will be a difference, particularly to me, basketball and volleyball, right? I think those are the big ones that are going to be stuff like track, and Oregon has a great track program and a great track stadium. Things like, those kind of sports, wrestling or whatever, more meet-based programs that don't have as much travel, they'll be fine. I think it's the basketballs and volleyball that's the biggest thing.
There's not a ton of sports, because that's one thing that I was able to find out. You talk about those meet sports where you've got a group of schools or a group of teams kind of playing in a particular area. Track is one where you get a group of schools together and you have a meet, you have relays, you have conference meets, and so on and so forth. So it's a handful of schools. I think the travel thing, they're going to figure it out. They're going to go, teams on the West Coast, they're going to fly into Chicago. They're going to play Northwestern. They're going to play Wisconsin. They're going to play Illinois. Kind of a we call it a West Coast swing if you're kind of going the other way. But, a Midwest swing if you're kind of looking at it from the West Coast point of view. So I think they're going to figure it out. They're going to figure it out. Now, right on my show last week talking, I had a USC guy on my show, and I said at that time, I thought Oregon stacked up. When I look ahead to 2024, I thought they stacked up maybe at the top of tier 2. I look at your Ohio States, your Michigans, your Penn States, maybe USC right there in tier 1. Where do you think they stack up? Now, I do a little bit more research on Oregon, and we're going to talk about recruiting here in just a minute. They're a top 10 program when it comes to bringing in talent on the recruiting trail right now. Where do you think that they can stack up in the Big Ten when they hit the field in 2024?
Yeah, it's not surprising to hear a USC fan say that, but I think it depends on how you. That's another little rivalry that will be coming with us. But I think it depends on what you consider tier 1. To me, I consider tier 1 to be Ohio State and Michigan, and I put Penn State in the top of tier 2. And I would say I'd put Oregon. I don't know how you could look at Oregon and USC and not put them in the same tier, because Oregon actually has more talent and more depth right now, and has done more in recent years with that, and has out recruited USC 6 years straight. It was a tie last year, and then 5 years straight before that. So if someone wants to put USC in tier 1, I think unless that's either based on you're giving them credit for stuff that happened 20 years ago, or you're giving them credit for Lincoln Riley's reputation. But if you want to actually just take the names, take the uniforms away, and you look at how the teams stack up on the field, I think they're in the same tier. So whether you think that's tier 1 or tier 2 just depends on where you draw that line.
I think a lot of it is based on what Lincoln Riley has been able to do over the course of time. But you mentioned recruiting. Oregon has kind of been a notch. I think even in this year, they're maybe just a notch above. I think they're third, if I remember looking correctly, in the recruiting rankings for the Big Ten for 2024.
It's fourth, but
is it fourth?
Yeah, it's fourth. But if you look at it, like 2, 3, and 4 are all basically tied. Right. But Ohio State is there, and then Penn State, Michigan, and Oregon are all like tied for second, basically. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, the more you kind of dive into it, and the more I kind of dive into it, USC, of course, had a really good year last season. It kind of all came crumbling down a little bit at the season when Caleb Williams and his leg kind of came crumbling down in that Utah game, so to speak. So let's talk about it. As long as we're talking about it, let's chat about USC. Yeah. And let's chat about Oregon. You got that Oregon-Washington rivalry coming in, but I view Oregon and USC as that West, because these are the two best brands on the West Coast, west of the Rocky Mountains, west of the state of Texas. Maybe Utah could get thrown in there. But in terms of brands, I think it's Oregon, and I think it's USC. Now, you've got a rivalry, but do you think that this rivalry between the Trojans and Ducks is going to develop even more in the Big Ten, especially if there's maybe Big Ten title game appearances on the line?
Yeah, I think most definitely. I mean, if you look at that rivalry, really kind of started to heat up in the late 2000s. USC was on their big run, right, where they won like 7 or 8 Pac-12 titles in a row and a couple national titles. And then we kind of started rising and took that crown from them and carried it along with Stanford for a little while there in the early 2010s. And then if you look at, I mean, USC's won 1 Pac-12 title in 15 years. One out of 15. And so Oregon has really been that kind of steady program throughout the last 25 years, right? It was USC and Oregon, then it was Oregon and Stanford, then Oregon went away for a couple of years, and it became Washington, and then it became Oregon and Utah, right? And that's kind of where we're at now. And if you look back to last season, touching on that real quick, the quirks of the scheduling, USC didn't play Oregon last year, nor did they play Washington, who are two of the top 4 teams in the conference. And Washington didn't play Utah. So both Washington and USC had a little bit of an easier conference schedule last year. This year is going to be really interesting and exciting in the last year of the Pac-12 because all 4 of those teams all play each other this year. So I think it'll be a true round robin at the top, and whoever comes out unscathed will really have. It won't be because you got to play them and you didn't have to. It'll be like, okay, you won all 3 of those, or you won 2 out of 3, and then got to that title game.
I'm by no means maybe comparing it to this rivalry, but when I was thinking about this today, I was thinking about throughout the 80s and the 90s, maybe even going back to the 70s, you had Nebraska and Oklahoma in the Big 8. They were rivals because whoever won that football game knew that they were in the national championship hunt when you got to January, and the winner of that game was going to go down to the Orange Bowl. I could see Oregon and USC and developing a similar type of thing, that the winner of that game could possibly have an edge getting to the Big Ten championship and bragging rights as maybe the top West Coast team over there.
Yeah. I mean, certainly bragging rights for the top West Coast team. I think it'll be those 2. I think UCLA and Washington will both be kind of in that second or third tier that you were talking about. And look, I know Washington beat us last year and they won 11 games. But if you look at the trajectory, they're a very senior heavy team. They're going to have a lot of turnover going into the first season in the Big Ten, and they haven't been backfilling. Most of their talent on the roster right now was recruited under Chip Peterson, blue chip talent. If you look at what's going on there, all those guys are still there for one more year, and then this year they'll go on. They'll either graduate out or go to the NFL. And the 24th season, their first one in the Big Ten, they just haven't been backfilling that talent. So I think they're going to take a step back. Whether they can start recruiting again to the level that gets them back up there, I think they have the capacity to. I think that's the open question with them. So I'm with you. I think it's USC and Oregon for the West Coast. Yeah. Whether that gets us into the Big Ten title game, I mean, it's a tough league. I don't want to go that far, but also with the 12-team playoff, you don't necessarily have to, right? You can be 4th and make the playoff.
Boy, I tell you what, we can kind of go in that direction now. 2024 is going to be, the more we kind of go down the craziness, the more, 2023 is the end of an era. Let's call it as it is. And 2024 is a complete Texas and OU, SEC. Yep. You look at the 4 West Coast schools in the Big Ten. The Big 12 is completely different, right, with all their new schools coming in. I know UCF, Houston, Cincinnati, those schools are kind of, they get 1 year in 2023. But a lot of stuff, as you look at playoff, you look at the video game coming back that I think a lot of people are going to be excited about. 2024 is set to be completely different, and I view it almost as that NFL mindset, where when it comes to the playoffs, who's hot at the end of the year? In that 12-team playoff, who gets into the top 10 in the country? Maybe that top 8 you need to get into to get that at-large berth. Because remember, only the first round is on campus. Okay, if you're able to get past that first-round game, you get neutral sites against some of these top teams as we continue to go forward. You think Oregon is going to be a team that's going to be consistently in that playoff hunt, you think, with 12 teams?
It depends on how you define consistently, right? I think it also depends on, do they reduce the number of auto bids with the Pac-12 dying? Do they keep it at 6? Does that number go down to 5 or 4 even, or go to 0 like Greg Sankey and the SEC would like? I kind of look at it as in the current model. I kind of think the Big Ten annually will get either 3 or 4 teams in that playoff, right? So is Oregon one of the 3 or 4 teams? I would say, I think they certainly can be, and I would say as a fan we should be. Not necessarily every year, because there's going to be years where things don't break your way, your schedule's a little harder, maybe your starting a new quarterback, right? So, I mean, I'd say Ohio State's in there every year, right? No brainer. Right. You start looking at the other 3 or 4 spots, or 2 or 3 spots are available, and it's you got Michigan, you got Penn State, you got USC, you got Oregon, you got Wisconsin under Fickle now coming back up. I mean, that's too many teams, so they're not all going to make it every year. But I think 2 out of 3 years, 3 out of 4 years, half the time, I think that's a reasonable expectation for all of those teams I just named.
Well, here's the thing. When Matt Rule and Luke Fickell both got hired, I'm like, they both can't win 10 games every year. They can't. They just can't, especially when you have Ohio State. You got Penn State. You got Michigan in the conference. And zero division. So the West Division, kind of
Yep.
can't be on its own, so to speak. You're going to be playing some of these powerhouses every other year. And now you bring in an Oregon, now you bring in a Washington. It's going to be like we talked about the grind of the Big Ten, and then you add these teams, and then we talk about Florida State, and then we talk about some of these other teams like a Clemson or somebody like that. That's kind of where things get crazy right now with being able to compete over there in the Big Ten Conference. So
Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I still got you. Your video's a little choppy though. So.
I know. I don't know what happened there. I'm gonna try to reconnect that, but
we'll get
Doug talking in the meantime.
Yeah, we'll get Doug reconnected here in just a little bit. Great time to kind of go over some comments here of everybody that's kind of chiming in here today. We've got, let me clear my graphic here.
I think I'm back.
First. All right, we got him back. We got him back, ladies and gentlemen. There he is. All right, we
Technology.
got him back. You gotta love it. You gotta love it. We got Duck fans taking over the chat tonight. Let's just set that on Twitter. Let's see the Duck fans kind of come out in full force, and we got them coming up here. So let's kind of get back into the discussion here in just a little bit. There's a lot of news going on about Stanford and Cal right now. You guys kind of had some battles with Stanford. I want to say late 2000s, early 2010s. Jim Harbaugh going into David Shaw. USC was a little bit down at that point. You guys, Oregon and Stanford was kind of those guys to be able to compete for the Pac. Do you want to see them eventually in the league? Does it matter? How do you feel about Stanford and Cal right now?
Well, Cal's an afterthought. So, I mean, they don't matter from a football standpoint. Yeah. They're economically, their financials are just terrible. Nobody watches them, and they bring a lot of other challenges. So I mean, look, I'm as a fan of a team that's a newcomer for the conference, it's not my place to say what the Big Ten should do or shouldn't do. I'll leave that to the legacy members to decide. I could take them or leave them. Stanford, obviously, you mentioned, a little bit of history there on the field over the last, 15 years or so. I think there's if you go back from like 2009 to 2015, like we essentially took turns knocking each other out of either the BCS title game or the playoffs. I think over a 4 or 5 year stretch, if the game had been reversed, either way, one of those two teams is in either the title game or the playoffs. So, a little bit of bad blood there and on both sides. Just like, it's like, can we trade you that year for that year? And cause then we would have been in the playoffs and then you would have been in the playoffs. But, I mean, obviously they're a great academic institution. They've really fallen on hard times. They don't have a lot of fans support either. But again, if that's what the Big Ten wants to do, it'll help with travel with some of our other sports. So, I'll leave that for Big Ten people to decide.
I do not see Stanford and Cal, like you said, both getting in. I think it's Stanford. People have floated if both
Notre
Dame and Stanford kind of want to both get off their high horse, they could both come into the conference together. But I don't see that happening really on either side in the time being. And we talked about travel before, how maybe it's not as much as a concern right now as people make it out to be right now. All right, let's go into the Pac-12. We were talking about Stanford. We were talking about Cal. Of course, the Pac-12 heard a statement today from the Oregon State president. They're going to try to save it. They're going to give it the old college try to keep the Pac together. What will Oregon fans, what will you miss most, if anything, about being in the Pac-12 and the Pac-12 conference as a whole?
So, I mean, obviously there's a lot of history in the conference, and I would say, if you go back to pre-2010, it was a very highly thought of conference, very competitive nationally, right? And not just in football, but other sports, and it still is in a lot of other sports. It's still a very dominant conference in many sports, but from a football perspective, and then it just kind of fell off the map through complete mismanagement. At the conference level, at the school level, fan apathy across the landscape of most teams in the conference. Not all, not Oregon, not Utah. Washington State has great fan support. Small fan base, but very passionate. So, you're going to miss, obviously, if we don't play Oregon State, you're going to miss that, right? It's I think the 7th most played rivalry in all of college football. Hopefully we could keep that going in some form or fashion, but it's not going to be the same when you're not in the same conference, right? The road trip to Pullman is long and boring, but it's an interesting one. So I don't know. There's it's just history. You miss the nostalgia of things, but you also have to realize that the world changes and things move forward, and you have to change and grow with it. And you'll always have those memories and those histories to pull back on as well.
Exactly. So, if this is who knows if the pack is going to, even if they do pull it out and add some members from the Mountain West, which I don't foresee that happening because they've got a couple more years left on their deal. They got to pay exit fees. We all know we all know about that with the situation with San Diego State, right? They had to
Stanford's not playing in a conference with those teams.
That's a whole nother whole. They're trying to get into the ACC right now, and then you got Notre Dame. You got Jack Swarbrick saying we can't leave Stanford and Cal out to dry. It's like you're not even a full member. You don't even play. They
left themselves out to dry.
Oh my gosh, I'm glad we're in the same boat on that one with something like Stanford and Cal right now. Let's talk about one thing that really stood out to me when I kind of dug into Oregon a little bit. Your guy's president used to be Michael Schill, and he's not doing the greatest right now. You guys upgraded big time at the president. Okay, I did a video, I think, when John Carl Schultz got hired as the president at the University of Oregon, says this guy's coming from the provost position at the University of Wisconsin. I think he made comments publicly that said when USC and UCLA came in, when he was still the provost, I believe, at Wisconsin, he applauded the Big Ten for making expansion nationwide. How important has that transition been, John Carl Schultz being the president to eventually end up Oregon being in the Big Ten?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I can't speak to. I'm not in the inner circle of those conversations. I think Michael Schill, the old president, I did meet him a couple times at tailgates. Not a sports fan, not a sports guy.
Yep.
Nice enough guy. Wasn't really his thing. And he moved on to Northwestern and then inherited quite a mess over there that I don't think he's done himself any favors with how he's handled it either. But Schultz seems to have come in at the right person at the right time, obviously working with our excellent athletic director, Rob Mullins, who's been here for, 13 years now and just done an incredible job. And then, as you mentioned earlier, Phil Knight, right? Like anytime you're talking athletics at Oregon, Phil Knight's got some sort of involvement at some level. And I'd have to imagine that somewhere in this whole move to the Big Ten, there's been some Phil Knight involvement in that too. And that's, part of the benefit of being an Oregon fan and Oregon and for Oregon. Yeah.
So you said on your podcast, I remember listening to this very vividly, this is one of the best 2 days or one of the biggest 2 days in the history of Oregon was joining the Big Ten is what I'm referring to. The other day is when Phil Knight decided to start ponying up some cash at Oregon. For the Big Ten fans, and we know all about Phil Knight and the contributions to the University of Oregon, but kind of take us maybe behind the curtain or kind of tell us that how exactly Phil Knight, of course, the owner and everything, the head honcho over there at Nike, which of course Oregon is such a big part. Oregon and Nike now, it seems, are obviously tied at the hip. How did that relationship all start? Because it kind of goes back further than that, where Oregon is not the Oregon we know of it today.
Yeah, obviously Phil Knight grew up in Portland area or in the Oregon area, and then went to University of Oregon to run track. Yep. I ran track there under the great coach Bill Bowerman way back in the day in the 50s and early 60s. Left there and then went on his journey and eventually founded Nike, which then obviously has grown into a $50 billion company now. And really, I'm sure he was giving it to various levels of Oregon for many, many years. But I think that's probably a little bit hyperbolic in saying a single day. I don't think it was necessarily a single day, but I think, at some point he decided to step up his support from an athletic standpoint, really start investing in Oregon athletics and obviously particularly Oregon football. And I think there's a couple it happened a little bit in the late 90s, early 2000s. That's when also like Oregon and Nike really started partnering really closely on marketing and PR and branding. And that's when the uniform games started happening. Yeah. And when the billboard goes up in Times Square and highlighter uniform against Mississippi State in 2003 that got everyone talking. So all that stuff. And then I think there was kind of a couple of moments in the mid 2000s, huge expansion of the stadium, renovation of the stadium was a big investment that just led to more. And then there was this is a story that's been told and by the media a lot that's been told over the years, is that there was a bowl game in 2006 and Oregon just got wiped off the field. It was not competitive by any way, shape, or form. Got blown out, scored 30 points or something. And at that point, Phil came to Mike Bellotti, who was the coach at the time, and the administrators at Oregon, and said, "What do you need? What do you need so we don't have to watch this again?" And that was kind of that key moment where the investment level, and it didn't just happen overnight, right? It was a slow build. It was like, okay, you give some money, they use it well. You see a step up in play, step up in performance, a step up a level of in the tiers of college football, right? And then some more money comes in, and then you see more improvement, right? So it just became increasing investments over the years, and then obviously the huge practice facility that got a lot of buzz back, almost 10 years ago now, which was a major, like kind of one of those still rated like the top 3 in the country, right? Or not the practice facility, the athletic facility, right? Football facility. That was another big one. And then we got another indoor practice facility that looks like a spaceship that's going to get built here in the next year or so. If you haven't seen those renderings, you can check them out online. So, and then obviously through the Mario Cristobal era, and particularly in the Dan Lanning era, where you've seen that investment is what they're putting into staffing, coaching, off-field assistance, all of the bells and whistles and everything you need to run a program at an elite level.
Boy, for many years, really, like you said, ever since the mid-2000s, the facilities at Oregon have been a big selling point for the development of that program going forward. Okay, I kind of gave you this one earlier in the day when I said what we're going to talk about. Okay, we know about the West Coast schools. We know about UCLA, USC, Washington. But what about the other 14 schools? Have you thought about which other teams in the Big Ten Oregon could maybe form a rivalry with? Bucks versus Ducks, Ohio State, Oregon, maybe that's something that could stick. Have you thought about maybe stadiums and places you'd like to see? How do you think Oregon might form some rivalries in the Big Ten once we get there?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above, and I'm looking forward to all of it. I mean, I think rivalries will just form themselves, right?
Naturally,
I mean, you can't make them happen, but you can maybe predict some or wish for some. Obviously, Ohio State, everybody hates Ohio State, right? They're the big dog, so you don't want to be their rival. They were supposed to come out to Autzen in 2000, and unfortunately, we all know what happened that year. I actually made the trip with the team, not with the team, but I also made the trip to watch the team when we went to Ohio Stadium in 2021 and knocked them off, which was just a phenomenal day, phenomenal weekend for me as a Duck fan, but also just being in Ohio Stadium with all those fans and before and after the game. And that was an incredible experience. I'm hoping we'll get them in a return trip now, maybe next year, maybe 2024. That would be pretty cool. But honestly, and I know you're a Wisconsin fan, Wisconsin's one that I think could be a real interesting one. I mean, obviously we played in a couple Rose Bowls over the last 12 years, and Oregon was able to be on the winning side of both of those. But I'm sure that one could be fun. And Camp Randall's a place I want to go. It's definitely high on I actually built a list 1 through 14 of which stadiums I want to go to, and they were in the top 3 for sure.
What was your top 5? Do you have your top 5 off?
I mean, certainly Beaver Stadium, Penn State. Especially if it's a whiteout game, I've got to go to that. I've been to Ohio Stadium, so that was a little bit lower since I've already been. Big House. I wasn't able to go to the game when Oregon went in 2007 to the Big House and just destroyed Michigan 39-7. So when we go back there, I'll definitely be making that trip. Camp Randall was up there. I think those are probably the top 4. I kind of thought Ohio. I hear things about Ohio or Iowa. Sorry, that might be interesting. Kinnick. Those are probably the primary, the first ones that came to mind anyway.
Yeah, that's those are all good ones. I've been to a few Wisconsin games. 2010 when they were able to knock off number 1 Ohio State. Electric atmosphere at night. Wisconsin, you participate and jump around and it changes you.
Yeah.
And it changes you. And the game day atmosphere, that's the thing that I love about. I don't know, maybe you can go a little bit into some unique game day atmospheres out west with maybe some of these schools coming in, but that's what I love. The game day atmospheres. Wisconsin has a great one. Iowa, you kind of mentioned all these other teams, great tailgating, great fans. I know I hate to bring up your rival, but I know they got the sailgating.
We'll talk about that. Yeah.
We'll talk about sailgating a little bit, which is
Yeah.
unique, which I think Big Ten fans are going to maybe gravitate to that. For Wisconsin, UW versus UW, Wisconsin and Washington could maybe something that could possibly work out as well. Let's talk about the Ducks in 2023. All right, let's talk about the field, because 2023, of course, is the bridge as we get to 2024. In the brief amount of research I was able to do kind of coming into this one, you return your leading passer in Bo Nix, who's, if you think of Auburn, Bo Nix, and that's what's in your head, this is totally different. He's gotten a lot better in this Oregon system, no question about that. Bucky Irving, a name that Big Ten fans should know, former Minnesota running back, he's back again. And Troy Franklin, what did the 2023 Ducks look like? Because to me, it looks like they're a Pac-12 contender. Maybe college football playoff?
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe.
4-team era. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's in the car. Like it's certainly possible. It's hard to predict that in the 4-team era, right? And it's a tough conference at the top right now. And then, of course, even if you win it, how many losses you have? How do you stack up against, some other teams? But yeah, I mean, Oregon was 7-2 in conference last year. They actually were 6-0 and lost the Washington game after Bo Nix got hurt toward the end of the game, and then was able to knock off eventual champion Utah in week 12 before blowing a 24-point lead to Oregon State and losing the final game of the year, which kept Oregon out of the Pac-12 title game. It would have been USC and Oregon, which is the game that everybody was wanting to see. USC and Oregon haven't played since 2019 in the regular season. And so I don't count COVID year, so throw that out. Yeah. And so everyone was looking for that. I think they were clearly the two best teams in the conference last year. The Knicks injury really derailed Oregon's end of the season. He's back and fully healthy. It's a 4-team conference. I think, you've got USC, you got Oregon, Washington, Utah. So I think, and again, I mentioned earlier, all those teams are going to play each other. Oregon, Washington, and USC all had top 10 defenses in the country, offenses in the country last year. So they were all top 10. And I think they all return a lot. So I think they're all going to be really, really good offenses again. I think the key this year is which one of those 3 teams is able to improve their defense, because all 3 of them had pretty bad defenses last year. USC's was terrible outside of turnovers. Washington's was a little bit better, but couldn't stop the pass. And Oregon couldn't get off the field on 3rd down. And so if one of those teams is able to take a step forward on defense, I think that's a team that's going to have the advantage to maybe win the Pac-12. And maybe, like you said, if you have 1 loss or less, then you got that shot to get to that playoff game.
Now, 2024 is going to be kind of like USC's in the same boat as well. You're going to have some kind of turnover, right? If Bo Nix, who knows what happens with Bucky Irving, because I think he's a junior this season, Franklin, that kind of thing. You guys got a quarterback that I think you recruited a couple of years back, a 5-star quarterback. You said that was in that group. Thompson, I believe his last name was. I don't remember.
Ty Thompson, yeah.
Ty Thompson, thank you. Is he a guy that you think can take this Oregon team to the next level? Is he kind of the quarterback of the future for the Ducks once they get to the Big Ten?
I don't think so.
Okay.
He's been here a couple of years now. He hasn't played a ton, but when he's played, you just haven't really seen that yet. And maybe that's a little unfair. He is entering his 4th year of the program now, so maybe we'll see some steps this year from him. If I had to bet, I don't think the starter for next year is on the roster right now.
Interesting.
I think so he's on the roster. You have another true freshman, Austin Novosad, who was recruited during the 23 cycle. And then you have two commits at quarterback in the 24 class, who obviously are still in high school. I think there'll be another transfer this offseason. Okay. Now, the big thing last year is Oregon actually had Dante Moore, 5-star quarterback, committed last year's class, as I know Midwest fans will be aware of. And then he flipped very late to UCLA. If he was on the roster this year, learning behind Bo Nix, yeah, absolutely. I think he would be the starter next year. But with that miss, I think it's probably going to be going to the portal.
So I put this out on Twitter, and I did get some responses. And I just want to hear your take, because I got a pretty good feeling what it's going to be. If Oregon would have joined the Big Ten, I don't know, 6 to 8 months ago, which could have happened. Does Dante Moore flip to UCLA?
It's a great question. I think he probably still does. I think the big linchpin there was the offensive coordinator, Kenny Dillingham, who he had a long-standing relationship with, had been recruiting him at Florida State. And once he left to go be the head coach at Arizona State, I think that was the bigger linchpin. Maybe, but I don't think so. I think he still flips.
Sure. Yeah. That's a very, like you said, that's a very interesting thing because it's kind of, I mean, he might be the guy this year at UCLA. I know they
Yeah,
brought in some
yeah.
transfers and everything, but from what I've kind of kept an eye on Dante Moore because, of course, he's going to be a big part of the Big Ten once he joins. He could possibly evolve into maybe one of the Big Ten's best quarterbacks. So, but they might get him going kind of this year just to get him reps. So once he does get into the Big Ten in 2024, things go pretty well for them right now. Is there anything that maybe Oregon fans, as they look forward to their transition to the Big Ten, or maybe what's one thing of this football team that absolutely needs to be figured out, absolutely needs to be corrected, and really needs to be dialed up before they get to the Big Ten, would you say?
So I think it's a great question. I mean, I think if you look at what they've done on the recruiting trail in the last couple of classes, filling really holes in every position, I think quarterback is the big thing. I do. I really think quarterback's the glaring one. I think obviously we'll know more the answer to that question after this year. It's the second year of Dan Lanning as a head coach, second year of the staff. I think we'll get a little bit better sense. If you were going to ask me that question for 2023, I'd say we need better edge rushing. We need better safety play. We need significantly better linebacker play, right? But we could see improvement in one or all of those areas this current season. And if we do, then I think it really becomes the quarterback first and foremost going into 24.
Yeah, we know how important that is going to be as well because you look at Dante Moore at UCLA, Malachi Nelson's a guy, recruit over at USC, so you got to get that quarterback kind of figured out going forward. It's going to be very interesting to see how things kind of adjust going forward. I just took a couple of notes. Like I said at the beginning of this, we're going to jump back and forth and kind of jumping back and forth right now. This is kind of Oregon has won 7 of 10 against USC, kind of jumping back to that last thing. Like I said, maybe myself and maybe others have said, well, yeah, USC, Lincoln Riley, Caleb Williams coming off a Heisman Trophy, but Oregon, especially as of late, haven't played the regular season since 2019 as well. Last season, I think they came so close. Oregon, you look at 3 losses, of course, that season opening.
Yeah, let's just
against
flush
Georgia.
that one. Yeah. I went to that game, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
I flushed it pretty quick.
Georgia's Georgia, right? But 2 Pac-12 losses by a combined 7 points. Washington game and the Oregon State game. Do you think if those 2 games maybe would have flipped the other way, this could have been an Oregon team? Because USC was in perfect position to slide right in to the college football playoff. You think this is an Oregon team that could have slid right in to the college football playoff possibly if maybe one or both of those games would have flipped the other way?
Yeah, well, certainly you'd have to have them both because you would have still had the Georgia loss. But yeah, if Oregon wins both of those, they're 11-1, and they're playing USC, who's 11-1, and the winner of that game is definitely in the college football. I don't think there's any way they wouldn't have been.
Right. Yeah. Let's talk about recruiting here for just a minute because that's something that's very interesting to me. This has been recruiting for Oregon that has been in the top 10 in the country pretty much ever since 2021. Let's kind of take a look. These are on 3 rankings. 2021, 6th in the country. 2022, 11th in the country. 2023, 7th in the country. They currently stand at 11th in the country. When it comes to recruiting, which we know is the lifeblood of our sport, acquiring that talent, keeping that talent around, does Oregon's recruiting take a jump while in the Big Ten, or does it become more competitive? Maybe do they stay stagnant? Maybe take a little bit of a dip down? How do you see the recruiting and the competition within the Big Ten on the trail affecting Oregon?
I certainly don't think it hurts it. I don't. Yeah. I mean, Oregon is a unique recruiting, especially from teams that recruit in the top of the country, right? So Oregon doesn't have any talent in Oregon. There's very little homegrown talent. There's a little bit in Washington that Oregon dips into here and there. We've obviously historically always made our lifeblood recruiting California. Yeah. But if you look back over the last 6-7 years, that footprint has grown nationally. I think we have this year 15 different states represented in our recruiting class. There was one, I think it was the 21 class where we had the number 1 recruit in 7 states that were part of our class. So we've certainly been a Western recruiting power. Certainly under Carable, under Cristobal for a while. We dipped into the Southeast quite a little bit under Cristobal, but it was more for a lot of 3 stars, right? And then not discounting them, but it was more like 2nd-tier players in the Southeast. I think where you've seen the difference with Lanning is twofold. We're still competing with USC in California. In fact, we're beating them on the trail as much or more than they're beating us in head-to-head battles in California and Southern California, especially in this year as well. And then you look at where we've grown, where we've actually stepped up quite a bit the last couple cycles is Texas. So we've really been hitting Texas hard. We've got a huge pipeline going this year in Maryland, in DMV area of all places. So we have 3 commits from DMV area. We got some out of Florida. And I think where we're differently in the Southeast is we're actually getting tier 1 recruits in the Southeast. Not a ton, right? We're not.
Right.
And obviously we got Georgia beat us for straight up this year for like 5 guys straight, which was pretty heartbreaking, but it's Georgia. But we're still getting that level of recruit. So because we recruit from all over the country, we're not relying on any one area. And I think where Oregon has been hurt the last 2 cycles is the uncertainty of where are you going to be playing? What conference are you going to be in? Who are you going to be playing against? What TV network are you going to be on? Well, now that uncertainty is gone, then some of those recruits who maybe in 22 or the 23 class or the 24 class, or maybe we're a little like, not so sure. I'm not saying we're going to flip them. I'm just saying as you get to the 25 class or 26 class, that concern is now gone. And it's really, when you're on the West Coast, it's you or USC. And it's that head-up battle, and we've been doing really well there. And then that extra Big Ten, prestige, then maybe gets you in the door with some other guys across the country that got that door shut on for you. So I think it's going to go up. That short answer. I think it's going to go up.
Let's talk about recruiting. I think Roger here comments, Roger got to Dakota Fields. Was that the recruit that flipped from USC to Oregon like a couple of days after joining the Big Ten?
Okay, yep, Dakota Fields. Yep.
That kind of something that really stood out to me. Maybe it was just coincidence and timing, or can you kind of go into that a little bit? Do you think it was a Big Ten move that kind of sparked this? Or can you go into that?
I think more coincidence with that one. Okay. I'm sure it didn't hurt, but he had actually been considered a strong Oregon lean throughout the whole cycle. He had a USC official visit set up for first weekend of June, an Oregon official visit set up for the last weekend in June. And he showed up to the USC visit, committed, shut down all his other visits, and never came. It was kind of surprising to everyone. And so then Oregon was able to get him back out for our camp at the end of July. This is before the Big Ten thing happened, or right around the time it was starting to, maybe come together. And then after that, we started hearing that flip was likely to happen, and then of course it ended up happening. I think he did that flip on his birthday, but there's been several of those type of battles with USC. They've got a couple, we've got a couple, but I'm looking forward to continue to see that happen in the Big Ten too.
Well, it's back and forth, and it's competitive between USC and Oregon, it looks like, is what you're saying. And I'll have to follow that a little bit more closely here as we get ahead towards 2024, because I think a lot of people were thinking, well, no divisions. We're going to see Michigan. We're going to see Ohio State. Maybe we'll see Penn State. Maybe we'll see, some of these other teams. I love to see the competition because we don't want to see Michigan and Ohio State playing it every year. I think when you look at it from a Big Ten standpoint, it's good to have that variety and to have Oregon competing with a team like USC on the West Coast for some of those better recruits is good. It's great, obviously, for the Big Ten. I want to talk about TV for just a minute because you mentioned this on your podcast. You're not playing in 480i anymore, right? On the Pac-12 network, all right? The Big Ten network, crystal clear 1080, baby. How is that going to affect things? Because the Pac-12 network, when you're playing a non-conference game, or maybe you're playing Arizona State, whatever, maybe a lesser Colorado, kind of a lesser Pac-12 team. How important is that going to be? We're going to talk about the Fox, the CBS, the NBC, but specifically from the conference network. The Pac-12 is, man, it's crazy to me that's what Larry Scott really said. Well, I don't know, but the Longhorn Network, we gotta really prop up this Pac-12 network, and that's maybe a decision that might have killed the Pac 10, 15 years ago.
One of many.
One of many. That's a very good point. But how big of a difference is that, having the Big Ten network versus something like the Pac-12 network for maybe some of these smaller, maybe not so much marquee games, non-conference, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, for Oregon, we didn't play on the Pac-12 network a whole lot. I mean, there's the conference rule is you have to play on there a number of times equal to the number of home non-conference games. So that's 2 or 3 every year. Okay. And we pretty much hit our minimum every year. And then we were always on Fox or ESPN or FS1 or something for the other games. But the games when you are on there, nobody gets it. And then what's crazy is like, okay, this is your conference network. You can play the games during the day when at least if somebody on the other East Coast would want to watch it, they could, but no, they would still have all the games at night. It made no sense. Like everything about that network was a disaster. I'm excited about the Big Ten network. I mean, I said this on Twitter and on the podcast. I think I was blown away the day that all this got announced, and we're watching the Big Ten Network cover the Oregon and Washington moving to the Big Ten the entire day with live coverage and analysts coming in and out of the studio and all those tweets that were being sent out by the Big Ten Conference and the Big Ten Network. And I'm just like, holy crap, this is what having a real conference network looks like. I've never seen this before. It was amazing.
So when you say, because obviously I'm not out there, and so when you say nobody gets the Pac-12 network, is it because it's buried on some of these sports extra tiers, or kind of what? Because the
it's
Big
not
Ten,
even on.
It's not even okay. It's because
like a DirecTV, you could never had it, never carried it once. A lot of cable companies, they never got a deal with DirecTV. A lot of the other cable companies that carried it early dropped it because it was always in an extra tier, right? And I think it has 16 million subscribers nationwide. It's a very small number. And then the games on it aren't great either, right? So that's been the other problem.
That's crazy. That's crazy to me that it's just not on some providers in the area, because the Big Ten Network's on everything, and it's not buried on.
I have the Big Ten Network, out here, and there's a lot of people that say that I can watch the SEC network, I can watch the Big Ten network.
Yeah.
I can't watch the Pac-12 network. In fact, my school's a half an hour away. It was the worst. It was just a nightmare.
I've heard many jokes about the Pac-12 network, but it's interesting to kind of see that insight.
They're all true.
As well. Jeez. So here's kind of one thing. We're kind of crossing over from the Big Ten to Oregon. Kind of one player that Iowa is losing a couple of really good linebackers. And one player that they were expecting to kind of jump in was Justin Jacobs, here from Matt Reeves, who I believe is an Iowa fan. I think I've seen him in our chat before. How's Justin Jacobs doing? Because he kind of misses him in Iowa City. Is he slated to kind of be in a starting role for Oregon this year?
I think so. I mean, they keep things pretty buttoned down as usual. Okay. I think Oregon's going to have they play 2 inside linebackers, right? And I think they're going to have 4 people playing that position. I expect him to be one of the starters. And if he's not, he's certainly going to be heavy in the rotation, but I think he'll be a starter. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. Because that was a big thing for Iowa, losing him. And then they had to kind of go into the transfer portal to get a linebacker of their own over there. We talked about recruiting. We talked about rivalries. We talked about Stanford and Cal. What excites you the most about this move? We've kind of broken down a fair amount, a couple of layers of this, but generally just what stands out to you, and what maybe then after this we'll maybe talk about the big 3 in terms of television.
Yeah, I mean, something I said before, I'll just repeat, just being in the Power 2, being in the future of college football, right? Like if you're not in that, where are you going to be 5, 6, 7 years ago from now? So like the goal was always like, how do we get into the club? And so just being in the club is the first thing. I think the second thing is something you kind of touched on earlier, is these fan bases, right? Like out here on the West Coast, and some of these traditions and rituals you talked about, right? Like sailgating's great at Washington. When they're playing well, they have a really good fan base. Oregon has a really passionate fan base. In our stadium, we have Shout is our third quarter tradition, which I know Purdue also has, and there's a backstory there. And then Utah has a great fan base. But beyond those 3, like you go to some of these stadiums and they're just lifeless, or they're half full. There's just a real lack of it's just a fan apathy. And so for me, the excitement is twofold. Like one, when I go on that road to go to all those stadiums we talked about and some of the other ones, seeing passionate fan bases at those schools, before the game, but also when they come out here. When Nebraska came out here a few years ago in 2017, I was at that game, and they brought a ton of people, and they were excited to be there. And we had great interactions. Right? I'm just looking for that. Like right now, Cal shows up and there's 3 people in the stands from Cal. And, Arizona schools don't bring anybody, right? There's just no passion and energy in most of those fan bases. And so that's what I'm looking forward to, is that week to week to week excitement.
Let's kind of go off on that a little bit, because I did a show or a live stream months ago when it was kind of rumored to a Stanford and Cal, because I heard about this fan sport. There's no fans out there. I kind of just wanted some background information. I did find an article, I believe. I got to go find the link again. When Christian McCaffrey was there at Stanford, there was an article that said, well, he was kind of living in a house or an apartment or a dorm with a group of guys over there, and he's gone for 5 hours playing a game, and when he comes back, the guys say, "Where were you?" And they were students at Stanford. It's just like, it's crazy to me. Why do you think on the West Coast, why is the lack of fan support there? Because that's been something that's been talked about a lot. And for these teams that are moving to the Big Ten, they love being in a conference now with the Wisconsins, Iowas, Ohio State, Nebraska, with those rabid fan bases. Why is it on the West Coast? Is there just too much going on, or what's the deal over there?
I think there's a lot. There's a lot to unpack there. You probably do a whole hour just about that. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah.
I think just there's the political angle. I don't want to go there. But cultural, right? Like I think it's just culturally different. In the Big Ten and the Southeast, right? Like people eat, breathe, sleep football, and I think people like me and some others do that out here. But it's a much smaller number of people, much smaller percentage of people. I think there's a lot of outdoor activity in the West, and so people have more variety of hobbies and things like that, especially from an outdoor standpoint at that time of year. Football participation from peewee up through high school is dropping precipitously every year, particularly in California, which is a real problem for the long-term health of recruiting and other things. And yes, to answer Hummus there, both of those fan bases are solid, especially Washington State. Washington State has a solid fan base year in, year out, always support their team. Oregon State, when they're doing well like they are now, has a really strong fan base. I'd say the problem with both of those fan bases though is they're small, right?
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
passionate, but they're not large.
Yeah. What do you think happens when Oregon State just kind of went under this big stadium renovation? I assume spent a good amount of money on that as well. They've kind of put more money into their resources. Where do you? Because to me, even though they're trying to put the pack together and patch it up with some of these schools, it seems to me like they end up in the Mountain West, which is not a bad option.
I think for them, it's probably the only option on the
Right.
table. And even if they end up reconstituting the Pac-12, it's just the Mountain West with a Pac-12 name, right? So,
Right. Yeah.
And that's sad, right? I don't want that for Oregon State or Washington State. If you look at revenue and spending, they spend more like a Group of Five Mountain West school than they spend like a Pac-12 school or a Power Five, Power Four, whatever you want to call it, school, right? So they're under resourced already, and it's incredible what both of those programs have been able to do, playing with half the money that schools like Oregon have. And so Oregon State fans don't want to hear this, and probably Washington State fans don't want to either. But I actually think over the long term, there could be in a much better position in playing in a league like that, because they actually are set up to dominate a league like that. They have not won a Pac-12 title outright in over 60 years, and they could go win that league every other year or every year or 2 out of 3 years, right? They could have, and again, you're playing at maybe a tier below level of football, but you're playing at a tier that you're playing with your peers, that from a financial standpoint and a competitive standpoint, and ultimately as a fan base, what's a better thing, right? Would you rather go win 10 games every year in a conference that you're competitive in and have a lot of fun doing that and win some bowl games or whatever happens in the postseason for that level of football in the future?
Yeah.
Or would you rather go 6-6 most years and occasionally you have this magic season every 20 years where you win 10 games? Like, I don't know. I kind of think it's a better place for them, but that's going to be an adjustment for them, and they have to go through that, and we'll see where that ends up.
College football playoff era, you have the guaranteed auto bid, essentially, even though it's not really said that way, for the top Group of Five champion. Look, here's the thing about I know Stanford and Cal, maybe we mentioned this before, aren't exactly pushing sports a lot, but you look at it from an Oregon State and Washington State standpoint. You put OSU and Wazoo in the Mountain West. You look at Boise State. You look at San Diego. This could be one of the top Group of Five leagues. And then
Definitely.
You kind of look at college football playoff. Maybe there's that option out there. We got a question here coming in from one of our viewers that shows up on our streams, HD90 Dog here. Question to our host as well as our Oregon fans. Do you think NIL money improves, or is it a non-factor? I assume he's saying with the move to the Big Ten.
I mean, Oregon has, by everyone who follows this stuff, and of course nobody really knows the real numbers, right? But I think Oregon is pretty well understood to have a very strong NIL program right now.
Yep.
I don't think it gets worse. It either stays the same or gets better.
So we got another question here. This one from Gerald McKinley. This one's been thrown around a little bit. Big Ten hockey for Oregon. I did see that maybe that they're a good, decent club program. Maybe could they look to upgrade to Division I?
I could see that down the road. I don't think it's going to be. I think, well, obviously with the half share, for the first 6 years, there's not going to be any additional, sports added. I think obviously you've got Title IX implications of all that as well. I do think that that's something that could be down the road in the 2030s and beyond, when you get to that next TV deal where Oregon becomes a full share member. Things like hockey, wrestling, other sports might come back into play, but I would not predict that in the short term, no.
Because the great thing is about TV, and we'll kind of transition into the Big Three portion portion of this as well. Where the Big Ten Network, I think, really succeeds is the broadcast of their Olympic sports. There's a lot of variety, and hockey is a big one in terms of getting that exposure for that type of program. Let's go into the Fox. Let's go into the CBS, the NBC. You guys kind of covered that on your podcast. Now, of course, the Pac-12 had a deal with Fox and ESPN, and of course, there were big-time deals. But remember, one of those ESPN time slots was Pac-12 After Dark out there as well. You got Fox in the noon window, which is 9 o'clock out there for you guys. You got CBS, which is going to be a big game, a prime game, NBC. And these games, they're going to kind of have a TV draft, so to speak, so where you could have the best game of the week in the 3:30. You could have one of the best games of the week in prime time. How big of a deal is that to have these three, an NFL-style window for a program like Oregon coming in? Now, they're already a national brand, no question about it, but how important is that television deal compared to what you guys had in the Pac-12 before?
I would say it's incredibly important, and that's one of the main reasons you need to move. I mean, if you look over the last couple of seasons, Oregon was in the top 12, top 15 as far as viewership in the country, and that's playing a lot of games that aren't very competitive against a lot of teams that don't. I would say, who's bringing the audience to the TV game, right? Like in most of the games that Oregon plays, they're bringing 80-90% of the audience. You're not getting anything from the other team. Cal's not bringing any viewers, right? So now if you're playing a game against Iowa or Nebraska or Wisconsin or Penn State, you're bringing your viewers, they're bringing their viewers, and that they have that multiplying effect. I think, going back to the windows, it's not so much compared to what we've had in the past. I think Oregon's been pretty well represented over the last few years on TV. It's more about what we would have had going forward, because those windows were gone. And whatever the Pac-12 would have been able to cobble together, it might have been the late night window on ESPN After Dark, might have been the best window that in the entire Pac-12 inventory. But that's just death. Nobody's going to watch you out east.
That's one thing that's been floated around before is, well, whether it's been Stanford or Cal or other teams, how do we, and it doesn't have to be expansion, it can just be creating more revenue for the Big Ten, for the league going forward. People have thought about, now we got 4 West Coast teams, what about the After Dark time slot? And I've heard that many times over the past months here on this channel, and I say, wait a minute, and maybe you can answer this as well and correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the After Dark time slot, which kind of a lot of people are sleeping at that point in other parts of the country, isn't that a big part why the Pac-12 is in the situation that it's in, and why maybe teams like a USC and an Oregon left that part, is to get more exposure? Or kind of give your take on that?
I mean, obviously there's basic geography and time zones in the play here, right? Like you can't help that you're on the this side of the country versus that side of the country, and it's nobody's fault. It's not even the network's fault, right? Or the fans out east or west. I do think I'm really interested to see if Fox decides to do anything with that time slot, because I think they have an opportunity to, if they want to, right? And maybe it's not all 13 weeks of the season. Maybe it's 8 weeks of the season, right? But if you're having an Oregon playing a Washington or a Washington playing a UCLA game, and you could put that in that time slot instead of on the Big Ten Network, let's say, for an example, or, maybe you've got a USC versus a preseason opponent, you could put that in that time, a game that's not going to be on one of your big 3 windows anyway, right? Because here's the thing. Any game you put in that time slot is going to feature Oregon, Washington, UCLA, or USC.
Correct.
That automatically will destroy anything ESPN could put on in that same time window. So if you're Fox, why not do that? Not every week. No, you're not going to put your best games there, right? You're not going to put an Ohio State at USC game there, but if you could put a Rutgers at USC game there, and it'll still beat the ESPN game.
So here's what I think, and how much the Big Ten factors this in right now, I don't know, but you got, that's the thing when you have teams on the East Coast, when you have teams in the Midwest, and they're playing out all the way out on the West Coast, it's a 9 o'clock kick, it's a 10 o'clock kick, and that's not something us in Big Ten country are used to doing, is staying up that late. So you could, like you said, you could maybe it's a non-conference game at home, maybe it's an Oregon versus a UCLA. Would you rather have that game on the Big Ten Network, say in a 3:30 Eastern type of time slot, or would you rather have it in an After Dark situation?
I think I'd rather have it as a mix. I think if I'm looking at my ideal, right, obviously you want to be on the big 3 as many times as you can. I think realistically, you're playing Ohio State, you're playing Michigan, you're playing Penn State, you play UC, you're going to be in one of those 3 slots, right? Beyond those teams, you're probably looking at either a Big Ten Network or an After Dark. To me, I'd say, yeah, I'd want to be in the middle of the day on Big Ten Network a couple of times. But I also think 1 or 2 games in that after dark slot, especially if we're playing like, some group of 5 team who's also on the West Coast, like why not play, that spot after dark is fine for those 1 or 2 games, and then have the rest be in that, Big Ten middle of the day.
Right. Yeah. So here's the thing that I think of when I see this whole TV thing unfolding. Fox is the number one, right? That's big noon kickoff. That's the number one for the Big Ten, right? And it has been. CBS was number one for the SEC, right? Since the 90s. And NBC is it just seems no matter what time slot you're in, it seems like a huge game, right? No matter who you put, whether it's Oregon against Illinois, right? And you mentioned before, Oregon against Illinois is going to draw way more than a West Coast regional matchup of, say, Oregon and Cal. There's so many advantages, I think, to all of this right now. We'll get Doug back up and running here. We got audio only, I think, right now for Doug. We'll get him back up and running here in just a minute, as we got a few more kind of comments coming on. You gotta love the technology and things that are happening right now. I think we might have him back here. I think we might have him back. All right, there we go.
I don't know what's going on. How fun.
We keep hey, this is live, baby. We're live. All right, let's talk about something here. And this is very interesting as well. This comes from someone that we get on our show a lot, Crab Cakes and Football. Phil Knight, Kevin Plank, uniform game when we talk about rivalries, Oregon and Maryland. Now, here's the thing about Maryland. You kind of mentioned their uniforms before, is they're actually this year going to more a traditional look. Solid red, script terps on the outside. They're not getting as crazy. But wouldn't it be great once a year just going crazy on the uniforms? There's a uniform game. There's a rivalry for you there, Doug.
Yeah, how about every other year? I don't want them to be a permanent rival.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Every other year, every 3 years, whatever it ends up being. Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of one thing that kind of popped into my mind as well. Kind of keep on going down the comments here. Just this Big Ten Network, Pac-12, it's kind of going in the right direction for everybody here. Doug, thanks for coming on here the show today. Really enjoyed this discussion of Big Ten, Oregon. It's very interesting. I think the technology is telling us it's time to hit the road. That's okay though. That's okay. I want to thank everybody for coming out here tonight. Doug, once again, where can people find you on Twitter, or is it X now? Where can people find you? Podcast, everything. It's your time to shine.
Yeah. So you can find me at Douglas TS on Twitter. I actually co-host the QB11 show, which is a podcast covering Oregon Ducks football. We also cover the Pac-12. We'll be expanding that coverage into the Big Ten this year as well. I do that with my co-host Andrew, whose moniker is QB11, which is where the show gets its name. So you can find us at QB11 show on Twitter. All those things are on Apple, Spotify, wherever else you get your podcasts, and hopefully YouTube soon as well. So now that I'm working out some of these technical kinks there, but I really appreciate you having me on the show, Ted.
Yeah, this is good stuff. I'm sure we'll talk to you here in the near future. Once again, thanks to Doug for joining us here tonight. So thanks, Doug.
Thank you. Oh, of course, now the video's fine.
Oh, now it's fine. There we go.
There we go.
That is what it is. Thanks again for joining me here tonight, Doug.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Doug Scott, everybody, from the QB11 show. I want to thank all the Oregon fans for joining me in the chat here tonight. There were a lot of you here at the start of the show, so we really appreciate you coming on board with Doug Scott tonight. I got some time here to kind of go through some comments, kind of wrapping things up here. We got HD90 Dog understands that the Pac teams will have another year out west, but I encourage you to stay tuned to Big Ten Ted. That's right here. We love our teams. We're pumped. I am pumped to see these West Coast teams in this league right now. Oregon, we mentioned when we were talking with Doug, we mentioned just how much of a force. Maybe you gotta kind of rearrange my tiers a little bit here as we kind of get closer to things as well. Hummus saying, thanks, Doug. Yeah, great discussion. Really was looking forward to this discussion. Cloudy, Oregon fans are ecstatic to be in the Big Ten. So many good matchups. Oregon, Ohio State, that kind of took place kind of a couple of years ago. That was a good game. Of course, Oregon came in to the Horseshoe when they were able to knock off the Ohio State Buckeyes. We'll see kind of what happens down the stretch. But watching Oregon kind of in preparation for this interview, I was impressed, you know. And Oregon's been a good team. They've been a good team for a very long time. So this is no surprise. No surprise as well. Want to thanks Mark here. Awesome show. Might as well sub to the Big Ten shows. And this is it. Big Ten Ted right here. So for those of you that maybe are new to the program, Oregon fans, during the season, I do previews of some of the biggest Big Ten games. I do reactions on Saturdays of some of the biggest Big Ten games, live streams, kind of ramping up my live stream game a little bit, maybe a couple of live streams per week with a lot of guests. Got a Big Ten prediction show kind of coming in as well here down the pike as well. Check it out, chiming in here. According to ESPN, Pac-12 quarterbacks are ranked higher. Boy, the Pac-12 has got some good quarterbacks this season. They've got some great quarterbacks from DJ Uiagalelei, Oregon State. We mentioned Bo Nix, Caleb Williams as well. There's some really good quarterbacks through Cameron Rising at Utah across the entire Big Ten as well. So I think that'll wrap it up here for tonight's show. Want to thank everybody for coming along for the ride here tonight. Big Ten Ted Live Tuesday night with Big 12 Mafia. Looking forward to that as well. It's going to be a good time. So until next time, I'm Big Ten Ted. We will see you in the next one.